Welcome to the Hidden Corners, where truth and terror collide. Discover a realm where the lines between the living and the supernatural blur, as you embark on a journey to the paranormal and visit the mysterious hidden corners of your mind.
Well, we're in Book 3 of the Wolfman Chronicles. This is Chapter 4, Werewolves and Dogs. As a wolf, every day is a battle for survival, a relentless struggle against the harsh realities of the wild. The weight of the world presses heavy upon my shoulders, a constant reminder of my solitary existence in a world teeming with dangers and uncertainties. As a wolf, I move through the landscape with cautious grace, my senses attuned to every shift in the wind, every rustle in the underbrush. There is no pack to watch my back, no companions to share the burden of the hunt. It's just me against the elements, relying solely on my own instincts and cunning to navigate the challenges that present themselves. The relentless pursuit of life in a world that shows no mercy to the weak. But as a man, I am burdened with the knowledge that evil exists, sometimes right outside my doorstep. Sheriff Buck Brady was not the clean, law-abiding citizen the town thought he was. That much was clear from the first two sets of photographs that Brandon had shown Jack and Miguel. He was involved in shady dealings with illegal cattle transporting, possibly even drugs, and his moral character was now in question after the discovery of the affair with Trixie. But it was the third set of photographs that really showed the sheriff in a whole new light. You see, no one really knew the sheriff very well. He'd been in town for a few years, hired just after Sheriff Parker had gotten too sick to work any longer. He just seemed to appear one day, appointed as the new sheriff. No one questioned his credentials or his background. If he was good enough for Sheriff Parker, then he was good enough for everyone else in town. He was tall, he was lean, dark-haired, dark-eyed. He had a scar that ran from his right eye down to the edge of his mouth in a crescent-shaped arc. He was quiet, unmarried, not much of a socializer. I remember clearly the day Lynn came home and told me there was a new sheriff in town and that Parker had resigned, Brandon said. We were all expecting it, of course. Parker had gotten really sick shortly after that whole Yeager affair. You'd already left for Washington or Colorado or wherever you were right then, and you already had Angus taking care of your ranch. So this new sheriff goes around and introduces himself to all the big landowners around here. Nobody thought anything about it. He started hanging around your ranch quite a bit, but we all just figured he was being friendly with Angus. No one suspected the relationship with Trixie. Now, we were seeing a lot more cattle trucks moving through town, but nobody really questioned that either. I think the townspeople just assumed that we had become somewhat of a thoroughfare for passing trucks on their way for other locations east. Why, we respect our law enforcement around here. No one ever had any reason to question him. But then, when Lynn's brother-in-law started doing his investigating, he found out that there was no background information on the sheriff. None at all. No employment records. No record of him being a cop anywhere. He just sort of appeared out of nowhere. So Scott started looking for anyone with the name Buck Brady. And that's when he came up with these photos I'm going to show you. At first, thought it was just a coincidence, someone with the same name. But then he discovered that our sheriff isn't who he says he is at all. Brandon handed Jack a photograph of a toothy, smiling young man in a football uniform, barely large enough to contain his bulk. Now another photograph showed this same young man at senior prom, with his red hair slicked back into a pompadour and a white rhinestone suit that rivaled anything Elvis ever wore. A third photograph showed the young man with his arm around a pretty brunette who was showing off an engagement ring on her finger. The stone on the ring was a sapphire, the same color blue as the boy's eyes. These were definitely not pictures of Sheriff Buck Brady. Billy Buck Brady had grown up in Elizabethtown, Illinois. He'd graduated top honors at his high school, and he'd lettered in football. Now, Buck Brady had bright red hair and freckles from one side of his face to the other, and a toothy smile that only a mom could love. His nickname had been Bucktooth Brady, and he sported a set of buck teeth that would make any rabbit jealous. Now, I don't understand, Jack commented. So this guy has the same name. It's definitely not our sheriff. Brandon handed him a clipping from Elizabethtown newspaper, the Hardin County Independent. Now, the headline read, "Local Boy Dead in Drowning Accident in the Ohio River." On Memorial Day weekend, while climbing at the Cave-in Rock State Park, Billy Buck Brady and his two friends attempted to jump from the cliffs into the water below. Buck Brady succumbed to injuries received when his head hit the rocks in a shallow section of water below the cliff. He was knocked unconscious and he drowned. The two other jumpers, Cliff Sutherland and Chase Whitmore, suffered minor injuries and were treated at the Hardin County General Hospital and released. Well, Jack passed that clipping and photos back to Brandon. See, this doesn't explain anything. I know it's not that common of a name, but this red-headed kid is definitely not our sheriff. He just has the same name. Besides that, he's no longer alive. It doesn't explain anything. Well, look at this one, Brandon replied. He handed Jack a copy of the yearbook page. Jack looked at the 20 or so faces on the page. The graduating senior class was so small in Elizabethtown that the faces fit all on one page. Billy Buck Brady was the second face in the top line of students. Even in the black and white photograph, you could see the freckles and the light skin. Now, further down the page was Cliff Sutherland, a homely, big-eyed kid with a buzz cut and big ears. And at the very bottom was Chase Whitmore, dark hair, dark eyes, with a crescent-shaped scar that ran from his right eye down to the corner of his mouth. Jack looked up from the photo. That's the sheriff. What the hell? Brandon nodded his head. Yep, Chase Whitmore. There's no mistaking that face or that scar, even though this photo must have been taken some 30 years ago. So why would he be using Buck's name, his identity? What a mess, Jack replied. First we have Angus and Trixie's death and my ranch hands. Then we've got this illegal cattle operation being held right at my ranch. And now we have a sheriff that's not who he says he is. Miguel finally spoke. Now, he'd been sitting back listening to the conversation between Brandon and Jack, but not participating. He was assessing the situation, as he liked to put it. First things first, Miguel said. You cannot trust this sheriff now that you know he's not who he says he is, and you can't let him know that you're on to him either. I suggest you play into his hands for a while, just kind of see what he's up to. He continued on. Here's my theory. I think he is looking to make Jack the fall guy. His reason to set Jack up is to hide his involvement in the movement of drugs through this cattle transportation scheme. Again, it's only my theory, but here's what I see. I think this guy, Chase Whitmore, wanted in on the drug trade, or maybe he was already involved. He saw an opportunity to pose as sheriff here when Parker got sick. Now, why he used his friend's name rather than make up one is hard to say, but he damn sure wouldn't have used his own name. Better to create an alias when you're dealing with the cartel. So he set himself up to funnel the cattle through Jack's ranch and use a fake identity to do it. From the photos, it looks like they were trucked into the feedlot where the drugs were removed and the dead cattle were trucked off to a processing plant. I don't know if Angus was in on it or if he was just being forced to comply by the sheriff. I don't think Angus would have done it if he wasn't being forced. Like I said, I've known him for years, Jack said. Well, it's possible that Angus didn't know about the drugs, but thought he was only moving cattle through the ranch, Brandon replied. Yep, and whether he did or didn't know about the drugs, Miguel continued, is besides the fact now. But I want you to think about something. I know a little bit about these cattle mules they're using to transport drugs from Colombia through Mexico, headed for the U.S. Those cartels don't play games if they don't get their money. You might think this killing looked like a wild beast the way guys were torn up, but from what I've heard you say, it sounded like a pissed-off Colombian drug lord to me. It is not uncommon for their henchmen to kill like this. In fact, one method of making someone talk is to cut their stomach and make their innards fall out while they're still alive. When you told me Angus died this way, that's the first thing I thought of. You've heard of a Colombian necktie, haven't you? Brandon stopped him. Please, Miguel, Lynn doesn't need to hear this. Lynn reached over and grabbed a hold of Brandon's hand appreciatively. Well, I won't go into details then, but it's gruesome. I wouldn't be surprised if they didn't try to force Angus into talking by killing his wife and hanging and eviscerating him. My guess is that your old sheriff boy has absconded with this money. That would piss off the cartel enough to do something like this. They probably even came after him. He blamed Angus. They killed everyone out at the ranch, and that's the way they do things in Mexico. Problem is, if they didn't turn up any money, they'll still be coming back for the sheriff. He'll either get himself killed or he'll say somebody else has the money. He looked at Jack. Someone like you. Lynn spoke up. You know, Miguel, that makes more sense than anything else we've thought of. But I'm still wondering how he got the job of sheriff in the first place. Now, surely Sheriff Parker would have had him checked out. Well, there towards the end, I'm not sure Parker had the ability to discern anything. But the department itself would have done the hiring, you'd think. Someone in human resources would have had to question his lack of background, Brandon replied. And there's still so many unanswered questions, Jack replied. I don't even know where to begin. Brandon nodded at it. Scott's still investigating. He's trying to find out what the connection is between Chase and Buck Brady. Now, he's looking for this girl that was in the photograph, the one with the ring, and Cliff Sutherland. We know they were friends, but what really happened that day Buck was killed? There's a lot more to this story that we need to figure out. He's also asking for copies of the hiring records from HR. Jack sighed. Meanwhile, we need to figure out what this sheriff plans to do about the deaths out at the ranch. If he was involved, he's done a good job of making it look like he doesn't know anything about it. Meanwhile, Sheriff Brady sat in his living room, staring out the window. He thought about leaving, throwing his bag into the truck and driving somewhere, anywhere, far away from here. He'd had enough money to live comfortably for a very long time. If he had a long time to live, that is. It had been a good few years. Running the cattle had been easy. All he had to do was adjust the books, make a few phone calls, hand a few extra dollars to the ranch hands that were willing to get their hands dirty. Angus had been the problem from the very beginning. Angus never did fully buy the story about the undercover operation. Well, maybe in the beginning when they'd done the fake bust, but the sheriff arranged for the drops in his covert operation that he'd bust the bad guy, take him to jail, which really was just a ride out of town, and all that money would supposedly be confiscated by the federal government. That's what he'd told Angus anyway. It was a good ruse at first. Angus, he just went along with it just fine, thinking he was doing the right thing. It wasn't until just recently that Angus had begun to question where all that money was going. It was seeing the same guy twice that did it. The guy that was supposed to be in jail, he'd said. Stupid for the boss to send the same guy twice. It all went so well before that. As long as he sent a share of the money to the boss in Colombia, everything went smoothly. But then Angus had to go and get nosy. And then the boss started questioning the amount of money moving through the operation and kept wanting more. So the sheriff had gotten angry, kept all the money from the last drop and blamed it on Angus. He figured he'd get Angus killed, then he could take Trixie and they'd buy a sexy sailboat and take off for God knows where, somewhere warm. He didn't figure Trixie would get killed too, or the ranch hands. That was a surprise and an unfortunate turn of events. And now Jack was back. And somehow he had to keep Jack from finding out the truth about what had been going on out at the ranch. He sighed. Maybe it'd be best if he just left town, right now, today. He walked upstairs and pulled his suitcase out of the closet. Morning in Mexico was bright and sunny. The sun poured through the window, leaving prisms of rainbow color across the wooden floorboards. Catherine was not feeling well. She'd been throwing up every morning for days. Usko was worried that she'd caught the flu and tried to get her to stay in bed, but she was restless. She walked down to the kitchen in her robe, pouring herself a cup of coffee. Took a sip, then poured it into the sink. "What's going on with you?" Rosa asked. "Oh, the smell of that bacon is turning my stomach upside down," Catherine replied. "Come here, girl." Rosa took Catherine's face in her hands and looked deeply into her eyes. "I would say maybe 6 weeks." "6 weeks? What are you saying?" Catherine replied. Rosa just smiled and patted her arm. "Let me make you some tea. I know just the thing that'll settle your stomach." "I'll be outside on the veranda. I've got to get away from the smell of that bacon." She walked outside into the sunshine, closing her eyes and lifting her face to the sun. She could pick up the smoky smell of the creosote bush and the fragrance of the sage. There were flowers in bloom out in the yard, and their sweet scent drifted by in the morning breeze. She could hear the buzzing of bees, a cricket chirping somewhere out near the barn, a red-tailed hawk screeching its lonesome cry somewhere out near the canyon. Her senses were sharp, on edge. Another wave of nausea swept over her, and she felt her head grow dizzy. She knelt down, sitting on the step, and took a deep breath. She was worried that she might be dying, that the massive blood loss she'd experienced while in the Russian laboratory had somehow affected her health. Rosa stepped out onto the veranda with 2 cups of tea in her hand. She handed one to Catherine and sat down beside her on the step. "When did you lose your mother?" she asked. Catherine had not thought of her mother in months, and suddenly the flash of memories overwhelmed her. She sobbed, and Rosa put her arms around Catherine's shoulder. "Shh, mi chiquita, mi little one, you are emotional. You should expect that. You will be a mama soon." "What?" Catherine gasped. "You think I'm pregnant?" Rosa smiled and patted her hand. "I don't think it, sweet child. I know it." Catherine stared into her cup of tea. Could it be true? She thought she was too old to have a child. She'd be 40 soon. She hadn't even considered the idea of having a child. She loved Usko, but what would he think of this? She laid her head on Rosa's shoulder and just sobbed. Julian and Usko were in the barn, brushing and tending to the horses. Juanita had driven into town early to run some errands, and that left Rosa and Catherine alone to talk. "Do you have any children, Rosa?" She laughed. "I feel like I've been raising Juanita and Miguel my whole life. Those 2 were so much trouble. I never felt the need to have any of my own. I was their nanny when they were very young. I took care of their parents after the kids left to seek adventure and a life out on their own. When Miguel's mama died, I thought he would die of a broken heart. He asked me to come out here to the ranch and live. He didn't want me to work, but I refused. I told him if I was going to live with him, I would pay my way. Besides, I don't like to share my kitchen." She laughed again. Then Juanita moved in, and we've been a family ever since. It has been my greatest blessing to see those 2 grow up. And now to see my little Juanita getting married. And you, mi chiquita, you will bring a new blessing into this house. I hope that you and Usko will live here with us in Mexico." Catherine, breathing in deeply, said, "I have no idea my life would turn out like this. I had just opened my art gallery in Telluride. I figured I'd meet some handsome man out skiing. I never dreamed I'd meet a reindeer herder from Mongolia. Life has been very interesting this past year. I know Usko misses his home and his mom. He'll want to go back, even if it's only for a few months. And I miss my Colorado snowy mountains." She grinned and she sighed. "But I think that we can live in all 3 worlds, Mongolia, Mexico, and the U.S. Why not?" She patted her belly. "This little one will be a world traveler." Rosa laughed. "Yes, she will." "She?" "Oh, yes, I have a feeling for that. She is a little La Loba, a little she-wolf. Catherine grinned. I can't wait to tell Usco. Well, Miguel and Jack drove out to Jack's ranch to see what it looked like now that the cleanup crew had been there, to clean up all remaining evidence and bloodstains from the crime scene. It was late afternoon, and they hadn't heard from the sheriff all day long. I don't expect anyone will be out there, but let's swing around the back side of the property and check it out anyways. We can take the left fork of the road. I've got a dirt road that runs alongside that back pasture, circles around to the house. There's a ridge line up there where we can stop and we can look down on the entire ranch. Sounds good to me, Miguel replied. The dirt lane was just wide enough for a pickup. The cowboys used it occasionally when they were doing fence repair or if a young calf was in distress and needed to be carried out on a skid. Damn, I better not scratch this rental truck up, Miguel laughed. Yeah, it's a bit overgrown back here. I was on it last night coming over from Brandon's, but I was running. I didn't notice just how narrow it had become. Sorry, Miguel. A large branch had come down across the road, so Miguel stopped the truck. The two men got out to remove the tree branch. I'm surprised the back road's in this condition. I would have thought that Angus would have the guys keeping this clear. It's the back way out of the ranch. But still, it's important to keep a clear access road, Jack mentioned as they dragged the branch out of the way. Jack looked up from the branch at Miguel. I told you I was just down this road last night. I was checking out the ranch before the cleanup crew got to it, Miguel. This branch was not blocking this road last night. The two men began searching the ground for footprints. Jack whispered, Someone dragged this here. If it's a trap, why would they assume we'd take the back road into the ranch? Maybe the main road's blocked as well, Miguel replied. Jack motioned for Miguel and pointed to the ground near his feet. There were no footprints, but there were several paw prints around the narrower end of the branch. Kneeling down, he could see saliva and bite marks on the narrow branches. I'll be damned. This was drug across the road by dogs or wolves. And there's more than one. These paw prints are much smaller than these, and these have a more pointed shape, Miguel added. Didn't you say there was a couple of missing Aussies, ranch dogs? Yeah, we always had several around the ranch. I know the last time I was down here, they'd just gotten two young pups. They'd be at least a year old by now, but I assumed they ran off when that scene down at the ranch went down. At least there weren't any dogs amongst the bodies that were found, not that I know of anyway. Well, they followed the tracks several hundred feet into the trees, where they were lost in the soft undergrowth and the fallen leaves that had gathered on the moist ground since last fall, turning into mulch. Patches of snow lay on the ground in places, but no tracks appeared in the snow. What do you think this means? Miguel asked. I've got a feeling that something, or someone, is waiting for us back at the ranch. I can't be sure about this, but I think this branch was pulled across this road just recently, and I think it's telling us not to go forward. Miguel nodded. Well, let's leave the truck right here and walk up to that ridgetop you mentioned, where we can look down at the ranch. I don't want to draw any attention to ourselves. The two men walked another mile up that dirt road. Looking down at the ranch below, they could see a pickup parked in front of Jack's house. It was a sheriff's pickup. Off in the far distance, a wolf watched as the men crested the ridgeline and looked down upon the ranch. At her side were two young Australian shepherds.